Hello, and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas into what it means to live as a follower of Jesus in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today I'm welcoming Hunter Farrell to the show. Hunter serves as the director of the World Mission Initiative of Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, having served 30 years as Presbyterian mission co-worker in Democratic Republic of Congo and Peru, area coordinator and director of World Mission for Presbyterian Church, PC U.S.A. Farrell earned his doctorate in cultural anthropology at the Pontifical Catholic University in Peru, and his MDiv in cross-cultural studies at Fuller Theological Seminary. Along with S.B. Kleep, he is the co-author of the book Freeing Congregational Mission, A Practical Vision for Companionship, Cultural Humility, and Co-Development. Farrell is an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church, U.S.A., and married to Ruth Brand Farrell, with whom he raised 3 children, now grown. So let's welcome Hunter to the show. All right, welcome to the show, Hunter Farrell. Thanks for being here. What else would you like our listeners to know about you?
Yeah, well, thanks. Thanks for the invitation, because I've done, engaged in mission most of my life. And so I think about it a lot and pray about it a lot and engage in it. So this is an exciting conversation for me.
Awesome. Share, if you would, before we get started, what your faith journey looked like, kind of what it looked like coming to the faith, what it looks like today, and anything in between you want us to talk about.
Yeah, well, good. Thanks. I appreciate the question. I was raised in the church, so baptized as a child and raised in a pretty faithful household, folks, struggling to follow in the way of Jesus. In my teenage years, my family was, feeling some stress. There was some fracturing going on in the family. And my way of reacting to that was a bit of rebelliousness. Mm-hmm. I left the church for about 5 years. An elder in the church kind of kept tabs on me, didn't follow too close, but just was aware and would have coffee with me every once in a while, and invited me when I was about 21. He said, "I see that you've given up on the church in North America. I get that. Mm-hmm. I'd like to introduce you to the church in Africa." And so he set it up with our denomination to, I spent a year at age 22 as a volunteer in what's now the Democratic Republic of Congo. And to say it was a life-changing experience would sell it short. It profoundly challenged the way that I understood my life, my faith, my relationship with Jesus Christ. It was just such a gift in so many ways. So it was really Congolese Christians who drew me back into the church in some pretty profound ways. And so this book is really just kind of in keeping with that sense of an obligation that I have to share back some of those stories and really say thank you to not just Congolese Christians, but people in many different places who over the years have shepherded me and sort of pointed me back towards Jesus.
I don't know if I'm jumping in here already. I'm just kind of curious. Like you mentioned that you'd given up on the church in North America. Like, what was it that caused you to want to give up on them? And has there been reason to take them back, if that makes sense?
And it again, you're picking up on the 16-year-old self-righteousness that I think was very much a part of my defense mechanism. I can't handle the chaos of the world, and so I'm going to judge it. Mm-hmm. But I do think for myself, there were 2 parts of my Christian experience early on. I grew up in a well-to-do community in Dallas, pretty monocultural. My high school class, a public high school, but it was 100% white. And so those issues of poverty, of equity, of racial justice were pretty big in my teen years. The busing crisis was happening in Dallas, Texas of those years. And I just sort of watched it happening around, and I didn't see the church as being able to engage in the ministry of reconciliation, to work for justice and to be engaged in reconciliation. And that, to me, as a, again, a rather self-righteous 16-year-old, it felt like the church had to be about that. And I didn't see the church that I had experienced resembling very much the church that I read about in the New Testament. So, again, not to be too hard on the 16-year-old there, but there's a little self-righteousness in that. But the beautiful kind of trajectory of this book, I had worked overseas. I mean, I was ordained as a minister in 30 years ago, and have never pastored a church in the U.S. I've always worked overseas. I worked in Democratic Republic of Congo. I worked in Peru for 10 years. I worked with the mission agency of the Presbyterian Church. So was always engaged in global mission. And I think it's fair to say I was still pretty hard on the U.S. church in the early years, in those early professional years. What writing this book helped me to realize is we're all in this together. And there's no room really for folks sitting to the side and judging the rest of the church, because God doesn't call Lone Rangers. I don't think God calls us as individuals into God's mission in the world, but rather God calls us as God's people to participate joyfully, graciously in all that God is doing in the world. And that changes the game. So there was a point, one of the editors, the chief editor, I guess, of InterVarsity Press that published the book, wrote back his very first comment on the script, the manuscript that I'd written. He said, "Tell me about the anger." I was like, "Whoa, what anger?" Right?
Yeah.
Says the guy to his therapist, "What anger?" And so I that's put a hold on, like, for the next 6 months. I just went deep and said, "What is that about? Why am I being so judgmental towards folks engaged in short-term mission, towards folks who want to sponsor a child, towards folks?" And it allowed that question, really well-timed question, allowed me to do some of the deep work and really take it to the Lord and ask the question, what is this? What I found was I was being, judgmental towards others because I was being that way towards myself. And to release that to God, whose mission it is in the first place, allows me to participate with a lot more grace than I would otherwise. So, even the writing of the book has been a really healing process for me that I'm really grateful for.
Well, thanks for sharing all that. We're not even into the main conversation yet, and already some good conversation here, some good Pete's. Share, if you would, about a spiritual practice that's been meaningful for you.
We don't know each other, Lauren, but I am about as activist, other-centered. I'm very extroverted. I engage with people. I can go deep with a stranger very quickly. So all that are kind of descriptors of me. The most important spiritual practice for the last really 20 years, and it took me a while to find it, was, specifically journaling, and related to that, just the discipline of reflection. Because I was kind of that hyperactive kid, always distracted, jumping into the next conversation, moving on. And the gift of reflection is, at the end of a day, just to stop and say, where did I see God in this day? And what is God calling me to do as I greet the next day? And just kind of that two movement response to God's grace in the day has been really important to me, to stop and begin, because for myself, as I've disciplined myself to see God's hand today, I get up tomorrow anticipating, where will I see God in action? And that has been a really rich space for me. So I think it's that, in general, that kind of that discipline of reflection, and specifically the spiritual practice of journaling, has been really important to me.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for sharing all that. Sounds like you're comfortable sharing with that. sharing your stuff, but I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Well, I had Hunter on to talk about his book that he's already hinted at, Freeing Congregational Mission, A Practical Vision for Companionship, Cultural Humility, and Co-Development. And you've kind of teased out a little bit, talked a little bit about it, but just maybe talk about how the book came to be.
Yeah, well, thanks. So over the years, 30 years of working in global and local mission, I became painfully aware of the contradictions, right? The hopes and aspirations that we have as congregations in North America, struggling and desiring to follow God into the neighborhood, to cross lines of human difference, to love our neighbor. That's really difficult. One of the things that I don't think we do very well is kind of open our eyes to the past, to look at mission history that has done so many amazing things. If we look at just the last 500 years, the European missionary movement, it ended diseases, it advanced the role of women, it freed whole groups of people, saved languages that would have disappeared over time. I mean, just the number of lives saved, of people who came to Jesus Christ as a result of that movement, the growth of church and hospitals and educational systems. I mean, it's hard to calculate. At the same time, there's an underside to mission history that I think has seeped into the water that we drink as we think and talk and engage in mission today. And that's the kind of the unexamined colonial legacy that is just omnipresent, I find it, in the ways that we talk about mission, the way we conceptualize it, the way we engage in it. If you look at, I've done some research with a colleague, Bala Kalep, my co-author. He and I, for the last 6 years, have been researching a group of 1,200 congregational mission leaders that come from evangelical, mainline Protestant, and Catholic parishes or congregations. And as we talked with them, we became painfully aware of their struggle to deal with this colonial legacy on the one hand, and to help folks get a sense of how power has become part and parcel of the way that we engage in mission. So we set up relationships around the world where we deal the cards, we bring the goods, we provide almost all the materials, and oftentimes pay the whole freight. We pay everything, our travel and their expenses, in ways that don't honor the place that God has given them as co-participants in God's mission with us and with God. And so I think that's a real challenge. So that whole colonial legacy that hasn't really been looked at very much, I don't think, by churches in North America. I think that's a challenge. The twin side, the other side of this crisis that I believe we're facing, has to do with what I call selfie mission. And I don't think our grandparents would recognize much of what we do in mission today as the mission of Jesus Christ. And I say that with a lot of love and recognizing myself in that, because so many folks, when churches talk today about mission, how they engage in mission, oftentimes they're talking about personal transformation. This changed our church. We engage in mission because it draws youth in. It does all these things for our church. And in fact, as our grandparents would have testified, mission is all that we do for people outside the circle, outside the boundary lines that we have drawn between church and community. So, I do think those are kind of this twin crises that we face, the colonial mission and that selfie mission.
Yeah. Why don't we talk more about, in the book, you kind of talk about 3 eras of Christian mission. Why don't you describe those a little bit for our listeners?
Sure. Yeah. Just to kind of divide church history, 2,000 years, right, of Christian history, to divide that up in 3 parts. If we think of the first 500 years, more the early church, the patristics or the early church fathers, the missionary was a foreigner, right? This was the 12 apostles who flee persecution in Jerusalem and fan out across the known world, from Spain across to India by some legend, right? Mark to Egypt, Thomas to India, etc. As they go there, they speak the local language with an accent. They don't have any kinship who can provide social covering for them. They're disempowered in that local space. And so the missionary comes from the bottom, right? Comes from below.
Yeah.
And the flow of mission is from the bottom up. That changes in the imperial period between roughly AD 500 and 1500, when it is the imperial armies that, as they conquer different parts of Europe, send in chaplains to catechize and to Christianize the heathens, the foreigners, right?
Right.
And so that changes the power dynamic. We see that even more sharply beginning in 1500, what we call the European colonial period. And that introduces the missionary as occupying an ambivalent position. They're representatives of Jesus Christ, to be sure, but they also represent the colonial logic, which is we have the right to your raw materials. We have the right, in the case of Africa, we have the right to your bodies in terms of enslavement. All kinds of issues there that really confuse the ministry or the witness to Jesus Christ in that period. So one of the challenges, I think, to us today is how do we reverse that flow of mission to get away from that power position? We tend to step to the table and sit at the head of the table naturally. That's just where people want to seat us, right? Where we walk into a global context and people walk us to the front, sit in the front seat. Would you preach today, please?
Yeah.
Those kinds of things. And many of us have been in that situation. But I think Mission in the Way of Jesus Christ invites us into a different space, to take the power dynamic very seriously and to seek out spaces of mutuality, spaces of companionship is how we frame it in the book. How do we create a table where we're breaking bread together? A space of shared vulnerability where, if I guess Putin and Biden aren't going to have lunch together anytime soon, right? Because eating together involves a certain vulnerability. I might get spinach between my teeth, and you, as my friend, say, "Hey, Hunter, you got something caught right here," right?
Yeah.
But that's not going to happen on the world stage between adversaries. So, trying to create a space where we can dare to accompany our neighbor across lines of difference in the way of Jesus Christ, I think can be really powerful and transformative on both sides of the line. So that's the model that we develop in the book, kind of a theology of companionship.
Yeah, you have several things I want to touch on and go back to. So let me start here, perhaps. There's a key question you write in the book, and I think you've just kind of hinted at already, of whose mission is it anyway? You want to talk more about that key question?
Yeah. I think as I look at my own efforts, and so a lot of the book is sort of telling the stories on myself, but I think I'm not alone in North American Christianity. I think many of us struggle as we step into the space of mission, like that, the global church example that I gave. We're immediately given the first word and the last word. We're invited to preach. In fact, you can go on a global mission experience, you can go to a local community experience and never actually listen or be allowed to hear what other people think. Because people have constantly said, tell us what you think. You're the expert. You're coming in from outside.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the challenges is we're allowed, again, with this colonial background, we're allowed to mistake whose mission it is. That in fact, it's not God's mission from first to last, as Paul reminds us, but rather we're allowed to assume that it's our mission. And in fact, this is the church doesn't have a mission, as missional theologians discovered long ago, but rather God has a mission and graciously invites the church to join God in that mission. So I think we get our cart before the horse by putting ourselves or the church in front of God's mission, when in fact, I mean, to me, God's mission is like a trap door. You walk over it and you think you know what's going on, you think you're in charge, you think you're in control, and then the door opens and you're allowed to fall into the arms of people not your own, who graciously catch you and allow you to see from a different perspective your own faith in your own world. I think that can be really powerful, and I desire that. I covet that for Christian churches, sometimes we set up mission in such a controlled manner that there are very few variables. Now we laugh, oh, we didn't get hot water, or we didn't get the comforts that we had hoped for. But oftentimes, down to this pretty precise planning, we don't allow any space for the Spirit to move and to surprise us with what God has in store for us in that place. So I think the book is just an invitation to look beyond the good planning, which is important, but to be ready to allow for the Spirit to move and to push us into a direction that we would not have anticipated.
It's interesting. I've had conversations with other guests. You made your point about kind of that unexamined colonialist history, how it seeps into the waters. I think you said something like that. I've had conversations with other guests kind of about how in North American churches, it's kind of that similar dynamic of the white people are kind of like, we kind of just assume, myself identifying as a white person, like we have all the answers. And when we're going into communities of color, it's kind of like that same thing, rather than flipping the dynamic and learning from people of color and communities of color and churches of color about how to do church ourselves, rather than, again, thinking we have all the answers.
And yeah, I see that time and time again. And I think most of our siblings of color could provide a litany of just a long list of experiences that they've had. What I do think, that's helpful to me, is to recognize that there is a profound, I think it's a heartfelt invitation from God to join God in mission. And as we see, we try to develop in the chapter looking at a theology of companionship, that companionship always includes an attention, a particular attention to those who are marginalized. And it needs to include not just the presence, the participation, but the leadership of those who are marginalized, because they will necessarily see a bit more like Jesus because of that position of power. I think it does allow us to leave that space of power, to at least recognize that we stand in it. I don't know that we actually leave it.
Yeah.
But we can sort of acknowledge it. And it changes the dynamic immediately around the circle as we just name that power that we have because of this colonial legacy. I laugh, and there was no one I was closer to growing up than my grandmother. And my grandmother had received from her forebears all the racist language and assumptions that those generations were characterized by. And so she tried to protect me in Dallas, Texas, in the years that I was growing up, from people who were different from us, right? And so she transmitted a lot of those scripts, if you will. Right. And I, at age 25, was walking around in Washington, D.C. I got a job in Washington, D.C. And all of a sudden realized, oh my gosh, I've carried these scripts with me faithfully ever since I sat on my grandmother's knee. At what point am I going to take those out of the backpack, look at those and say, these are scripts that I'd like to carry. These faithfully reflect what Jesus wants me to do. And these others really don't. Now, my grandmother was a great Christian in many ways. And I have to say, these are scripts that I'm not going to be carrying because they don't reflect Jesus and Jesus' love for the world. So yeah, I do think it's a major issue in our relationships across the racial lines that we've drawn in this country, and it's particularly painful in these years.
Yeah, so you're hinting, or I'm hearing something that you write about in the book about poorly placed foundational stones. You just talked about how the kind of things have been given to you in your backpack didn't quite serve you well. What do you think are some of these poorly placed foundational stones that I'm going to assume it's come from the largely white North American Christian church?
Yeah, and so I write as a cis white male. That's what I am. I've generally been far from the poverty line. I've never missed a meal in my life through circumstances beyond my control, right? And so that puts me in a particular demographic and clearly a small minority of the world population, right? So as a Christian of the 1% church, right? I'm part of that. If you look across the global church, the U.S. church represents, we're present in that the 1% of the wealthiest of the churches across the world. That puts a particular burden on me. I need to be particularly aware, I think, of the power and privilege that I move through the world with.
Mm-hmm.
I think mission gives us an incredible gift that is almost untapped. As I look at denominations from evangelical to Catholic to mainline Protestant, so much work to address racial inequity in our country has happened almost kind of this battering ram technique where we try to batter down the front door of people's hearts, right, and convince them of the error of their ways. I've seen it in institutions. I've seen it in churches. I think mission opens up, in a sense, the kitchen door, a side door where we can actually sit down and have a cup of coffee and get to know each other and share a meal. And it's in that space of shared vulnerability, of companionship in God's mission, where we begin to untangle some of the issues of power and racial injustice and racial inequity that is such a part of the North American experience. So if a church is saying, when a church says, oh, finances are tight, we're going to do less mission this year, I would just pray for them, cast your bread on the waters.
Right.
This may be the year that you need to open up into more engagement, whether that's at the soup kitchen down the street or a clothes closet or global mission engagement, because that can be a space where God will just bust open the doors of the church to include a greater variety of the people that God's called to be part of God's work.
Yeah. So I'm curious if I can ask perhaps kind of a hard question, but I think probably in the last 6 to 9 months, and probably what drew me to the book is I've seen so much conversation on social media, just kind of just completely writing off global mission work, especially from the Christian church context. Now, I think one of the things that I appreciated the book was I thought was a nuanced approach that kind of acknowledged the bad, but also tried to find some good, which is certainly what I'm hearing from you already. What do you say to those who are again are kind of it's all just imperial colonialist stuff, because obviously you're acknowledging that past, but I guess is the question, is there enough good to be salvaged from that bad?
Wow, yeah, and you're asking a question almost, it's a God question, right?
Yeah.
And if God, in the last 500 years, to see all of, and I've read through the Spanish Chronicles to see the horrendous things that happen. The worst of the worst, in the name of Jesus Christ, the things that were perpetrated upon whole groups of people,
right.
From genocide to enslavement of more than 12 million people, all that together, and God still used that for blessing for many people. And so that just stops me cold. And I say, what the heck? This is a God who can take the darkest desires of human existence and transform those into blessing. Because when I try to do it in the book, I start listing all of the beautiful things that happened out of this European missionary movement that, I think most thinking people would raise some questions about, just given strategies and the power dynamic and all the rest. But to see that God can use even that for blessing, powerful blessing in the world, and to spread the church, the church just exploded in growth through that era. And it happened in part because of European missionaries, but even more as Jehu Hansels and some other folks who've been looking at church history with new eyes. Jehu Hansels, who himself was a refugee from Sierra Leone, now teaching at Emory in Atlanta, he looks at mission history and he sees the power of the local evangelist. And if, to be sure, the European or Euro-American missionary carried the good news in many senses, I'm Just speaking of this white legacy of mission
Sure.
that we've described. But that's all true. But the real growth of the church happens at the village level, happens at the street corner level, where local converts to Christianity are translating not only linguistically, but culturally what it means to follow Jesus in the local context. And that is so powerful. So that to me just shows the ability of a gracious God to take our tattered witness and make it a thing of beauty. So yeah, in the book, Short-Term Mission, everybody can throw rocks at short-term mission. All of us can make beautiful and eloquent critiques of short-term mission. But I would argue that's one of the thin places. That's a liminal space that our churches desperately need to be able to experience that space of vulnerability, that space of falling into the arms of a people not our own. So yeah, I would, if a church says, we don't have time for mission, we don't want to sully our, dirty our hands with, getting into imperialistic, colonialistic, racist mission, I say, yes, you're looking at it full force. Now allow God to take that and make that a beautiful thing of transformation for your congregation.
Yeah, so if I'm hearing you, let's dive into short-term mission trips, because I think you spend a good portion of the book talking about that, kind of examining that phenomenon, I guess we might say.
Yeah.
And I'm hearing different things, and I guess, again, it kind of speaks to your nuanced approach here. Because you said earlier, mission opens a side door, or at least as I wrote it down, mission opens a side door to people's hearts. But you also, you talk about how mission can really re-engage a church or faith community into responding to the Holy Spirit. But also, you talked about the selfie mission and how short-term mission trips can be this kind of self-aggrandizing experience. It's really not others-focused at all. How do we find a balance? Because again, if I'm hearing you right, you're not wanting to throw it all out completely. You're trying to find a healthy way. So talk more about like how a church or faith community can go on a short-term mission trip that's benefits them and helps them grow spiritually, but also helps another community.
Right. Yeah. No, it's a critical question you're asking. I really appreciate this, Lauren. I talk about the concept of slow mission in the book. Just encouraging, one of the questions that you and I were talking about earlier in the correspondence was kind of simple advice for a pastor or a leader who's thinking about a trip or planning a trip. And there's a lot of evidence. A researcher at Calvin University, Verbeek, he does a study and shows that the typical short-term mission trip without adequate orientation, daily reflection, and follow-up will actually increase ethnocentricity among participants.
Wow.
Ethnocentricity, so that means my culture, my way of doing things, and my straight white male ways of doing things are the better way. And that's a disease, that's a virus that's gone through the church, all in all different ways. And so to be able to engage in activities when you've got people, look at short-term mission. You have people in your congregation who are willing to put money down so that they can have this experience. To me, that's a leading of the Spirit. That's an open door that says, I'm willing to try something new. I'm willing to step out in faith. And for people who open their hearts in that way, I think God is faithful to show them perhaps not what they anticipated seeing, but something much more powerful and beyond even their wildest imagination. I've seen it. I worked in Peru for 10 years and received lots of mission groups. Almost monthly, there were groups coming, and a big part of the work that I did was to work with Peruvian partners in receiving different groups, and I did a lot of translating in those days. What sticks out to me is when you have a leader who is willing to ask some hard questions. Most of us are a little too comfortable, I would argue, with that missionary halo, right? It just, as we're engaged in mission, it just feels good. And so we don't ask some of those harder questions. But getting up each morning, and asking the question, where was God in yesterday's activities?
Mm-hmm.
And how did I use the power that was given to me yesterday?
Hmm.
How did I move in that space of power and privilege that so many people in this context were giving to me? They gave me the best seat. They gave me the best cut of meat. They gave me, a chance to speak. They asked my opinion. How many times did I ask someone else their opinion? I mean, to do that reality check around issues of power, I think, is really important. So part of the book, we've created this book. We really focused it on the needs of leaders in local congregations. And we wanted to provide them with the tools they needed as they lead their congregation in short-term mission trip, through a thorny conversation of, do we engage in child sponsorship or support for an orphanage, or how do we send funds to a local or a global need that we perceive. In all those conversations, we've tried to provide this book we have in its 8 tools to help congregational mission leaders, and we provide one of the tools is, in fact, the daily reflection guide that a short-term mission leader can just pick up and use. If they do it on that daily reflection practice, it will help them to avoid that kind of falling into the rut of increasing ethnocentricity. Our way is the best way. And even beyond that, just a sense of, we are benefactors. We're the doers of mission. These folks are passively receiving our mission that we're doing to them. When in fact, that's such a non-biblical way to see what's going on in that space, right? It's really God inviting all of us, some folks who have more money in their pockets, some folks who have less, some folks who have deep spiritual wisdom, some folks who have less, some folks who have all kinds of special needs and special abilities. It just strikes me that God is drawing us together for a purpose, and I think it's repeated in so many times in the book of Colossians that God's purpose is to draw all things together in Jesus Christ. And I think part of the intention is, in mission, God draws us together with people who we would not have considered to be even friends, much less siblings in Christ. So I think it does offer a wonderful space for the local leader who's willing to do it mindfully and engage in what we call slow mission, to ask some of these deeper questions that we try to provide in the book.
I think that slow mission really is a key point, because I'm just thinking of, I think in the book you quote like one mission leader who says something about feeling like a cruise trip director or something, if I remember, or like a party trip director, and just again, I think the temptation is to program. And if you're not programming as much, you're going to leave space for kind of that reflection, I can imagine. Right.
And what if we underprogrammed? And my insecurities as a teacher at Pittsburgh Seminary come out. I want to fill that class. I mean, I bring 3 times more material than I could possibly share, and oftentimes can choke out the Spirit from moving in that space of pause, of silence, of uncertainty on my part. And a student steps into a whole new role and says, could it be this? And suddenly it's a whole new conversation for which I'm deeply grateful, but I have to open up that space because of the power dynamic in the classroom. I think it's oftentimes similar, particularly for mission trip leaders. They may not recognize. We tend to, I think, in that interview I had with that particular mission leader, I recall the painfulness. And she saw herself as completely disempowered. She was kind of standing between church leadership that was saying, keep the campers happy. And she was trying to be faithful to what she understood to be this radical, life-changing mission experience. I do think mission opens the door to us to move beyond the mere purchase of an experience and to see ourselves in relationship with our neighbor in some radical ways. So that's my hope in the writing of this book.
Well, again, the book is Freeing Congregational Mission, a Practical Vision for Companionship, cultural humility, and co-development. Hunter, I want to ask you a million more questions, but we don't have time. Let's take a quick break, and we'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with Hunter Farrell. And Hunter, again, I'm biting my tongue here, but let's move on to these closing questions. You can take these, I tell folks, as seriously or not as you'd like to. But if you're a pope for a day, what does that day look like? What would you want to do? That kind of thing.
Wow. I can be honest. No one's ever asked me this question before. If I were Pope for a day, I think I would want to, Pope Francis is a figure whom I admire greatly. And I've worked a lot of years in Catholic countries where the primary shape of Christianity is strongly influenced by the Catholic tradition, especially Latin America, which was steeped in in Catholic tradition, and that was such a big part of the colonial experience. Francis strikes me as someone who genuinely tries to engage in mission in the way of Jesus Christ. And so a deep sensitivity to the power dynamics as Francis sort of pushes beyond the crowd. The security guys must be going wild. He moves into the crowd and embraces the child who appears to have special needs. I think I would try to take a page out of Francis's book and follow him. He's sort of a visual representation that helps me to see more deeply into the ministry of Jesus. I would. I think I would read. There's actually a couple of biographies that have come out on Francis recently. I think I'd immerse myself in that and prepare for my day, as Pope.
Good.
Thanks for the question.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
A theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
Do you know who fascinates me? Is Bartolomé de las Casas. He is a Dominican priest. He's born towards the end of the 15th century. He goes early in his career, before he becomes a priest, in fact, he travels from Spain, his native Spain. He travels to the island of Hispaniola, right? So the Dominican Republic, Haiti. And there he sees the decimation of the native population of that island, right? So there's like thousands of Spaniards, religious, non-religious, priests, missionaries, and mercenaries, right? They're all experiencing the same thing. But what is it about Bartolomé de las Casas that he reads the signs of the times, he looks at Scripture, and he asks poignant and urgent theological questions and challenges the church. He challenges the governor of Hispaniola. He preaches sermons against them. He travels back to Spain and engages in theological debate with the crown theologian at that time, Torquemada. It's just amazing to me, and I think, would that I had the courage to be, what are the signs of the times happening around us in an era of Christian nationalism? What am I doing to name those, to lift those up, and to begin to address them prayerfully, respectfully, but powerfully, with a sense of strength and conviction. I would love to spend a day with Bartolomé de las Casas and see, what was it like in the dark moments as he struggled against, talk about macro forces. It was like a tidal wave. What could he do against it?
Yeah.
And yet he was faithful throughout. After he had his kind of conversion experience, he never varied from that. And I admire that. So I'd be fascinated by some time with Bartolomé de las Casas.
Well, speaking of, you mentioned sign of the times. What do you think history will remember from our current place and time?
Wow. Yeah. Technology change, communication, the climate crisis. There's so much going on. So here, this is somewhat a prediction and a bit more of a prayer.
Sure.
One of the things that I see happening since like 1974, Lausanne Covenant gathering in Lausanne, 1974, you see evangelicals take a step closer to mainline Protestants and Catholics. There was a reticence on the part of evangelicals to name the social and physical manifestations of being in Christ. And you see in Lausanne just a major step as René Padilla of Ecuador, and who lived in Argentina most of his life, Samuel Escobar from Peru, and other evangelical Latin Americans who come forward and say, and they develop this concept of integral mission or holistic mission. And they made a case for, we evangelicals need to get on board. We need to move towards the fully orbed witness of faith in Jesus Christ. And so there, I think Samuel Escobar said, if all things are not under the lordship of Jesus Christ, then we're not under the lordship of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And so I see my, hope, prediction, and a prayer, probably more prayer than anything, is that we'll see a continuation. I've seen more movement on the evangelical side about getting serious about issues of human trafficking, about issues of religious persecution, a variety of different social issues, and I welcome that. I'm curious to see if I'm from the mainline Protestant family, and I'm curious to see if my folks on our side of the line are willing to take a step towards a more open sharing of faith. In classes at Pittsburgh Seminary, I'll ask students to share their testimony, and it makes most students profoundly uncomfortable. So I've shifted and asked, can you share the mighty works of God in your life?
Yeah.
Tell me of an incident or a chapter or what you've learned from that. And students then share. I mean, they're testifying. They have so much to share because they've seen the mighty acts of God. I wouldn't be here, they say, if it weren't for, and then they share the particular testimony. So I think there are ways sometimes we get caught up in the secularized language of our times. And I think it's time for us in the mainline mainline Protestant family, to reflect on the spiritual components of our faith that I think we sometimes set aside.
Well, this has been a great conversation. Really appreciate your time and your input here. Share, if you would, how people can connect with you, get a copy of the book, those kind of things.
Sure. Yeah. Easiest way is to go to freeingmission.com. So first word, freeingmission.com, and they can we'll send them to 5 different places where they can get books, from Amazon to local bookstores to InterVarsity Press itself. So yeah, and would welcome folks. We're encouraging folks to read the book and then gather a group of people to get in what we call a mission leaders circle. And that's where there's dozens of them going on around the country now, where they're gathering together and then working through the different study questions at the end of every chapter. And I'm going to do a group actually tomorrow morning, a group of folks who are gathering for that. So yeah, I think it helps us to sort of digest and again, take that slow mission approach to engaging in some of the parts of that book.
Yeah, that might be the key word for this episode, slow mission. So I love it. Appreciate, again, your time. Always leave folks with a word of peace. So may God's peace be with you.
Amen. Thank you for that.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romick-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.